We're going to take a look now at for loops in Java. And so for this video, I'm assuming that you've already watched the videos on how to do while loops and do while loops, because this video really is just going to be a comparison to those or a way to implement those kinds of loops in a different format, a different syntax. So if you haven't watched those while and do while videos yet, you need to stop here probably and go watch those and then come on back. In those other videos, we've talked about the idea of a counter-controlled loop for our examples of like counting from 1 to 10 or counting from whatever number to whatever other number, where it's a definite loop where we know the number of times it needs to iterate, and we're going to use a counter as our loop control variable. That is a really, really common type of loop. It turns out that we need to do that very often in computer programming. And just as one example that we will get to later on in the course with something called arrays, if you have kind of a list of data, like the roster of a class I think I used in a previous video, and we need to go and calculate the grade for each one of those, that information is going to be processed using a loop that starts at the top and just goes one at a time down to the bottom of the list or the end of the array. So this is a really common type of code that we have to write. Because it's so common, the developers of Java have given us a specific syntax just for that type of loop. And it's called a for loop. So the idea of a for loop really is that it's just a different syntax to do the same kind of loop we might do with a while, for example. And when I say that to students, I always get some students who come up with creative and interesting ways to say, well, you don't have to use it for that. You could use a for, and they've all this bizarre stuff. And that is great. And that sounds like a lot of fun to play with. But I'm talking mostly to beginners here. A for loop is used when we want to make a counter-controlled loop that's just really straightforward and really commonly used. So I'm not going to get into other interesting stuff we could do. The syntax looks like this. It's going to be the keyword for and then parentheses, but in that parentheses, instead of just having a Boolean expression like we have in our previous examples, we're going to have three separate statements, right? And then we're going to have our code block, which is basically the body of the loop. And those three statements are going to match up with these three kind of concepts or the three things we need to be aware of when we are making a loop, right? We have to initialize a control variable, we have to check a Boolean expression, and we have to update that control variable. Well, not coincidentally, that's what these three statements are there for. So let's go ahead and jump into Java and take a look at how this works when we want to write some code. So we have here just a real simple definite loop that we've implemented with the while keyword. And this is the example from that first video on while loops. And it shows a program that basically just counts from 1 to 10, okay? And so as we've discussed, we initialize a control variable, we check a Boolean expression, and then within that loop body, we make sure that we update that control variable. The idea with a for loop, again, is when we have something that's just a straightforward counter-controlled loop like that, we can use a very much simplified syntax to do that. And so what I'm going to do, I'm going to just comment out that code up above so that we still have it to look at. But I'm going to write the same loop using this for syntax. So I'm going to use the word for and then parentheses, and I'll go ahead and add my code block there. And in parentheses, I'm going to have these three statements. So I need to initialize my control variable. So I'm going to say int counter. I'll point out that I'm defining my variable there as well by putting the int keyword. So int counter equals 1, semicolon. Now what's my Boolean expression? Counter is less than or equal to 10, semicolon. And what is my update to the control variable? Counter plus plus. And then I'm going to come in here and I'm just going to steal that line of code from right there, clean up my typo. All right, let's give that a shot, see if it works. And it looks like it has executed correctly. So these three lines of code are equivalent to all of the lines of code, and it's not a really big loop up there, but it's equivalent to all the code that we wrote up there using a while loop to do the same thing. So a for loop can look really confusing to beginners, and especially if they try and start with a for loop, it's just like, well, what is this? And what are all these different things? The syntax is much different than other things we've seen so far in Java, putting 3 statements inside of parentheses like that, separated by semicolons. It's just sort of unusual. But if you just break it down and think about what those 3 elements are for our loop, and then say, okay, well, this is just an easy way to put those all in one line of code, then you're covered. Now, just like with any other counter-controlled loop, I can manipulate these values however I want. If I want a loop that goes from 20 to 200, counting by 5, and I could change it to that. Okay, so I'm going to initialize my value, my control variable to start at 20. I'm going to check that it is less than 200, and I'm going to keep iterating as long as it is, and then I'm going to add 5 to it each iteration. Let's go ahead and test that and see. Okay, and again, not the most exciting or interesting loop here, but the point is, these all function the same way within a for loop statement as they would function independently if we wrote it all out as a while loop. So it really is just a shorthand for the same kind of loop that you might write. And on that note, there's nothing you can do with a for loop, at least for now, that you can't also do with a while or a do while loop. So in that sense, it's almost as if a for loop is kind of optional. And if you're really struggling to get the hang of loops, then yeah, stick with while loops and do while loops until you understand them. The for loop is so useful and so commonly used in programming that I don't want to tell you it's really optional. You can't really go far in programming without running into this, and especially when you learn that there are some variations of for loops to help us with collections, arrays and array lists and things like that. You really are going to need to use it. But if you're just barely treading water with loops, you can survive without for loops for a little bit longer until you understand all of this a little bit better. And that's really all there is to a for loop. It can look confusing, especially if you're a beginner, but it really is a simple idea. We're just going to take all those things that we need to do in any counter-controlled loop, and we're just going to combine them into one really simple, straightforward syntax. And there, as I said, there's nothing you can do in one loop type that you can't do in the others. It really is just a matter of what fits best for what you're trying to do at the time. My rule of thumb to students, and again, this is just a rule of thumb, it's just a guideline or a starting point, but I tell students, if they're not sure, decide if it's a definite loop or an indefinite loop. Indefinite loops often work really well with while loops and do while loops, and definite loops often work really well with for loops. But again, you can do any kind of loop with any kind of loop structure that you want for the most part, and you'll be fine. My advice to students is that I really want you to know how to do all 3. So in my assignments, I will sometimes call out and say, well, I want a for loop that does this, or I want a while loop that does that, because I want you to demonstrate that you've learned them all. But really, it's just a matter of what fits the situation best and what you think what makes sense to you for that particular problem. So if you want to practice more with for loops, and here I've only given you this one example, you just take some while loop examples and you convert them and you rewrite them as for loops, and you'll be getting practice with that syntax. I'm also going to recommend something like W3 Schools has a really nice section on for loops, and it has kind of a virtualized environment there where you can try the syntax and you can mess around with it. So that's also a good place to go. As is always the case, just reach out if you have any questions.